Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Paul Seesequasis. Paul is a Saskatoon-based Willow Cree writer, curator, and cultural advocate. His most recent work is focused on Indigenous photography, historical narratives, and the process of visual reclamation. Paul's recent book, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, is a look at 8 Indigenous communities from across North America, shown through never-before-published archival photos, something that first started as a social media project. Paul, thanks so much for joining us on Face to Face, or what has become Face to Screen. About 5 years ago, you started sharing these photos on social media. What was behind your decision to start looking into the photographs?
You're right, it began 5 years ago, and I was really looking for a different framing of Indigenous life, Indigenous reality. It was around the time the Truth and Reconciliation Commission meetings were happening, and there's a lot of course, awful things that happened about residential schools and the whole framing of that. But my mom, who's a survivor, made a mention that there were a lot of positive family things that had happened, and it was family and kinship and the strength of community that kept language and culture alive through the hardest of times. So I began to look for photos that framed that provided a different framing of Indigenous reality from the 20s up to the 70s. And as I researched, I found more and more photos. I posted them online, and the response was quite tremendous.
Yeah, what was your reasoning for starting to share them on social media?
There were a couple of reasons, Dennis. One was just to present a visual kind of record of a positive framing of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous life. And secondly, and importantly, a lot of these photos came from museums, archives, historical societies, and quite a number of them had not been named. And by posting them on places like Facebook, as my following built up into the thousands, people began to identify them and say, that's my auntie, that's my uncle, that's my grandfather, or that's me 30 years ago. So it began this kind of visual reclamation, this naming of the people in the photos. So that took on its own life and became a really important aspect of the project itself.
Yeah, how incredible was it that people were starting to see themselves or family members or people that they knew in these photos that you were posting?
It was tremendous. It was tremendously rewarding. It was really what began to happen is a narrative, an oral narrative, if you will, even though it's on Facebook or Twitter. An oral narrative began to unfold. So it's not just the naming. I began to get this. People began to share the stories behind that photo. What was happening or what was happening in the community at that time. So that's where the idea gradually evolved, that this become not just a visual exercise online, but also a book and also eventually a visual exhibition. So everything kind of just grew organically out of that beginning and out of people's responses to the photos themselves.
Were there particular photographers that began to emerge who were taking many of these photos?
A lot of the photos initially are non-Indigenous photographers. I'm looking particularly for photographers who were not fly-in, fly-out kind of people, but actually had some relation to the community. They either were photojournalists who were, if you will, embedded in the community for a matter of months, or they worked, say, through Ministry of Natural Resources, and people in the community knew them. Because it's people are very, I think, the act of photography, there's a reluctance if you don't know that person, you're not as at ease. So a lot of the photos I was choosing in my sort of curatorial process was to find those photos where there was an element of ease and comfort between the subject and the photographer. So that's what I was looking for. And then also I was looking for those early Indigenous photographers. James Brady, a Métis photographer, also an activist. He began taking photos in the 30s. Peter Pitsiliak, Inuit photographer, began in the 40s. James Johnson, a Cree photographer in the Yukon, began in the 40s as well. So I began to look for those pioneering photographers who actually laid the groundwork for the dozens of really talented and gifted Indigenous photographers we have working today.
Did you have a chance to speak with some of the photographers?
A lot of the photographers I've used have passed, but I was able to speak with a couple of them. John McPhee is one. He worked in northwestern Ontario for decades. When I interviewed him, he was 95. Rennie Fumulo was a photographer up in Northwest Territories, and he did a lot of work with the Dene through the 60s and 70s, particularly when the burn on the Mackenzie Valley pipeline was happening. And I was able to interview him. Both have since passed on, so I feel I was very lucky that I was doing the research for the book when I was doing it a couple of years ago, because I could not have talked to those gentlemen today, obviously. And so the timing was right in that way. And also several of the people in the photos themselves that I interviewed have since passed on. So in some ways, I feel like I was recording stories that otherwise would be lost. So that was really a humbling and rewarding experience.
Absolutely. Paul, any idea how many photos you think you've gone through?
Oh my God. It's got to be in the thousands by now, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. It's only a selection that I choose, that I post online that fit within that kind of positive framework that I'm looking at. Mm-hmm. But there's a wealth of photos, and I feel like I've just touched the tip of the iceberg. I know there's photos probably sitting in someone's attic or someone's closet, or in, God forbid, in some pawn shop or somewhere that are invaluable. So I'm hoping also that more little treasures and discoveries will happen as this project continues.
Well, obviously it was garnering a lot of attention online, but book publishers were also watching. Did you expect this social media experiment would become a book?
There was no plan for that at all. So no, not at all. Everything just kind of evolved, Dennis. About 3 years ago now, Knopf Canada, Penguin Random House approached me and wondered if I'd be interested in doing a book. And I said, sure. Obviously, just the idea of having it in a book form, having the photos on paper as opposed to it them being digital made sense. Then the question was how to do it, because there's hundreds of photos. So the book that eventually became Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun really focused on 8 different regions, just because the immensity of the project itself would have made a book larger than that, not just a huge undertaking to write, but also very pricey in terms of the size of it. So eventually I whittled it down to 8 communities, and from there I did interviews, selected photos, and tried to tie a narrative that reflected that community at that time and did justice to the people who are in those photos and their stories. So it's a lot of interviews, a lot of waiting for people to call me back. I quickly learned to be patient. I remember trying to get a couple of interviews up in James Bay Cree country, and it was also at that time it was also the goose hunting season. So obviously no one was calling me back. So I quickly learned to patience and to time the research to fit into the natural cycle of what people were doing in different communities. So that was fun in itself.
Paul, we're going to talk much more about the book and look at some specific photos. We just got to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Paul Seesequasis. And Paul, you chose 8 communities to focus on for the book. What went into the decision on the communities that you would include?
It was based partly on the amount of photos I had from those communities, as well as what I felt I could get in terms of stories to go along with the photos. So in many of the communities I selected, I already had some sort of rapport with people on Facebook, online, so I knew there was enough of story developing that if I could pursue that, call someone up and get them to chat further, record them, I could construct a larger narrative to fit in with that photograph. So that was really the bottom line in terms of selecting the communities. Like I said, there could have been a lot of more communities, but 8 was basically fit into the size that the book could be. And even with that limited number of communities, it still is 80, close to 90 photos. So it still is a lot of photographs within there. So it was both the size factor and where the story was actually starting from.
So, Paul, you sent along some particular photos, and I'm hoping we can talk maybe about the stories behind them. The first one is of these 4 fine-looking gents. What do you know about this photo?
People have commented that they look like the Cree Ramones. It's Oliver Rupert, and I interviewed him. He was living in Fort George at the time. The community has since was moved, obviously, when the James Bay project went ahead. And he's the one in the middle there holding the stick with the hat on. And he's still a rocker, still part of the Fort George Rockers. They're still going. And they were touring, actually, when this photo was taken in 1973. And with the interview I did with him, it was probably the recording of the first and the only rock and roll tour I know of that went by canoe. They went by freight canoes to different communities up on eastern James Bay, loaded their amps and guitars on there. They used generators as a source of electricity. One time a storm came up and they got stranded on this island, and they were essentially overrun by mice. Another time one of the canoes swamped, so they're going to play at a wedding and there wasn't time to change or anything. So some of the band members were in hip waders. So it's just a hilarious rock and roll story, and one that belongs in a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame.
No kidding. Yeah, I think that would rival any other story out there traveling by canoe. The second photo you sent was from the Northwest Territories Archive, and it looks like a school taking place down by the water.
The photo is in Jean-Marie River in Northwest Territories in Dene country. You can see the children around there, the students. And one adult, her name is Teresa Carteret, and she and June Helm were doing research up in the community, and they won the trust of people in the community, adults in the community. And at the time, chief of the community, leader in the community, Louis Norwegian, Dene leader, he was younger than his brother had committed suicide at the residential school where the kids were sent off to. So he talked with other elders in Jean-Marie River, and they decided this is enough. We're keeping our children here. So they opted out of the residential school system. The federal government, of course, would not give them any support or funding at all. So what they did is they built their own log school.
Paul, the third photo here is of a woman holding a bag. What can you tell us about this picture?
Yes, the bag is actually a beaver tail purse. The girl's name is Emma Alfred. She would be in her young teens at the time. It would be 1951. And she's Northern Shoshone. And the photo was taken by Catherine McClellan, who was, and again, another amateur photographer, anthropologist, who was doing research up in the Yukon at the time with the Tlingit and with the Shoshone, etc. And Emma was holding her mother had made for her a beaver tail purse, and she posed for the photo. Within a year or two after that photo, the purse disappeared. No one knew what happened to it, whether it got stolen or whether it was sold by someone. It just was gone, and everyone assumed it was lost. A few years ago, Emma Alfred went down to the Canadian Museum of History because they were doing some research re-identifying objects with communities, and one of the communities happened to be where Emma was from. So she and a couple other elders, she's an elder now, of course, were flown down to Gatineau to the Canadian Museum of History. And there, she was looking at all the stuff, and then behind a glass partition, she saw that very purse you see in that photo. So that began another process. No one knows how it ended up there, but that began a process of reclaiming that purse and bringing it back to Emma. And also that photo, to me, it's a marvelous story because you have that photo with her holding the purse, and then finally, decades later, that purse is found again and is in the process of being returned to the family.
Incredible. The fourth photo you sent us appears to be a mother and her kids. What do you know about this picture?
It's very famous Inuk artist, Kanujuak Ashevik. And she's leaving the tent where she was staying with her two sons. I think her husband, Johnny Boy, is somewhere back in that tent. And of course, Ashevik became the most famous Inuk artist. This photo was taken in 1960, so she's very young. And it's within 2 years of the artistic cooperative being set up in Kinnae, which at the time was called Cape Dorset. Just recently had its name change officially. And the collective was very new, and these artists were very new. And a woman photojournalist named Rosemary Joliet Eaton happened to be up in Cape Dorset at the time. And it just was a historical time to be there because the cooperative was just getting going, and all these artists, including Ashevik, who are not yet famous, were just starting. So it really is one of those times when a photographer happens to be at the right place at the right time. And Rosemary Eaton had spent several days with Kanujuak. And so besides this photo of her coming out of the tent, there are photos of her in the tent. There's photos of her working inside the tent with her little studio and all the hundreds of little knickknacks she was using. There's photos of her working on her first prints. So it really is not just a beautiful photo, but I think an important moment in history and an important moment in Inuit art and how it would grow and become world famous.
And takes up a nice chunk of the book as well. Paul, we're going to continue the conversation. We do just need to step aside for one more break, and then we'll be right back on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Paul Seesequasis, and we've been talking about his most recent book, Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun. And Paul, you know, the photos are incredible, the stories behind them are incredible. And the book, when you read it, is a real history lesson on the communities and the times. Was it like that for you when you were doing all the research and the interviews?
Totally. I knew some of the general history of the communities I was writing about, of course, but when you start to talk to people who are actually in the photos and get their story and delve deeper, it's a whole different layer. It becomes more personalized. It becomes more heartfelt. It becomes more real. So I went beyond kind of just, I guess you would say, a textbook understanding of these communities to actually get a sense of the people living there, what they went through at the time of those photos, where they are today. So I really felt honored, and it was a privilege, frankly, to be able to talk with people, to get to know them, and for them to trust me enough to share their stories. And that was a very heartwarming and rewarding experience.
I bet. Paul, I wanted to ask you about an option when you're purchasing the book from your website, and that's to purchase the book for a prisoner. Why was that an important thing that you wanted to do?
I feel books are an educational thing. I also feel books are also a very healing thing. And I think we have so many, the percentage of Indigenous men, women, and youth in institutions is so out of proportion with our percentage of the population that I wanted to do something that at least gives something back to people in prisons. And so I set up this thing where people can purchase Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun and have it sent to people who are currently incarcerated. It provides them, I hope, with not just an educational read, but a book and a read that gives them hope and gives them comfort, and I think helps them to rebuild and come out feeling good at heart and well-based in terms of being able to adapt back up into society. So for me, really was an important part of the website, and I'm glad, and it's had a really good response. I'm glad people are responding to it.
Excellent. Yeah, it's a great idea. Paul, as you mentioned, you know, there's thousands of photos. Is there any chance you'll be doing a second book looking at different communities?
I am working on a second book. I can't say too much about it right now, Dennis, because it's still in the, shall we say, it's being framed. I'm still working on the exact details of it, and I don't want to say too much until it's actually all signed and ready and sealed to come out. But it is very much based on images. It will be different than Blanket Toss Under Midnight Sun, but it still will be inspired by and telling the stories of some of photographs and other images from our communities. So I'm just in the early stages of that, and I'm really enjoying it.
Well, that's exciting to hear for sure. Paul, before this global pandemic really became a reality, we were lucky enough to run into each other in Saskatoon.
Yes, we were.
How has this been for yourself as somebody who would typically be out there, speaking to people about the book or the photos, presentations? Yeah. How has this all impacted you?
I think like other writers, artists, musicians, anyone in the arts, really, this has really been a shock. There's been a lot of talk, and it certainly is a financial hit. I had a photo exhibition planned for Calgary. I had a trip up to a Dene youth camp. Lots of money that suddenly just disappeared that I was relying on. And I know there are other artists who are in more special situations than I am. They might be single parents. They might have rooming. They might have rent to pay, etc. So that loss of financial money that you're counting on, and being an artist for 99.9% of us is a precarious existence to begin with.
Right.
So once you kind of cut off that flow of income that you have, it really is it is a shock. What I am encouraged by is the way artists and Indigenous artists are coming together online through performances, through shared readings on social media. And to me, that's really encouraging. And it's the most important thing and most important message, I think, for us now is not to despair and to keep finding ways of being creative until, knock on wood, this pandemic has passed and life slowly returns to a different. I don't think it'll ever be like it was before, but it gets back to some sort of normalcy where we can actually be in front of an audience or sharing creativity with living human beings in real as opposed to being on a screen. But for now, we're on the screen, and I'm encouraged by the way people are being inventive and using that as a way of communicating and as a way of spreading artistic gifts around.
Well, Paul, hopefully around the time of the new book's arrival, we'll be back to normal and we'll have you here in studio for real this time.
I look forward to being in Winnipeg, Dennis. It'd be fun. So let's hope so.
Well, Paul, it's a real pleasure. Thanks for joining us. Be safe. I guess you got a bit of time to work on the book now, so we thank you for being on the show.
It's been my pleasure, and all the same to you, Dennis. Be safe and be healthy.
Thank you. That is all the time we have for the show today. We're always looking for new guests, so if you have any suggestions, please email us at news@aptn.ca. This show and past episodes are also available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/face-to-face podcast. I'm Dennis Ward. Thanks so much for tuning in to Face to Face. We'll see you next week.